But I will, if you're comfortable voicing your own question, then I'll call on you and you can just unmute. And if not, I'm happy to voice it for you, as will Frank be if and when he joins us with his students. So I think we're just about at time. This is, so I am representing the Decolonisation Research Group on behalf of Utrecht University, but really we extend beyond Utrecht University and are actively looking to do that. And our mission is to do research on decolonisation as a period and a process, also to tackle some of the epistemic ways in which the university still is colonial or is shaped by colonialism in unhelpful ways, and to amplify the voices of those who have not always been served well by the academy. And that is, so we try and have a really inclusive lineup. So these are some of the core missions of our group as a whole, and we always welcome new affiliations and new memberships and new connections. Today we welcome, in fact, Professor Michelle Moyd, and it is hard to find words to express how thrilled I am to be welcoming Professor Moyd to speak to us. I first heard Michelle, and I hope you don't mind if I use your first name, but I first heard Professor Moyd, present her research on World War I several years ago. I am ashamed to admit that it was the first time I had heard of the involvement of African troops fighting for the Germans in World War I. And that was purely my ignorance, because Professor Moyd has published extensively, too extensively, in fact, to list and still have a good time for question and answer. But please read her bio and, better still, the work that she has published. I'll just give two examples. Her book, Violent Intermediaries, African Soldiers, Conquest and Everyday Colonialism in German East Africa, came out in 2014. And you are currently working on Africa, Africans, and the First World War, a book which is under contract with Cambridge University Press and will expand our knowledge of that first global war, or World War Zero, as Dan Hicks calls it, enormously. Professor Moyd's work, your work, Michelle, has this eye-opening, jaw-dropping quality in which startling new insights, rigorous research, ethical commitment, and expansion of academic knowledge are conjoined. Yet sometimes these publication lists and accolades substitute for or obscure the qualities that create genuine ethical knowledge in the world. Professor Moyd also thinks about how language can liberate, oppress, and resist oppressive structures. And she herself uses language in these ways. So if you want to hear more about that, look at her essay on linguistic disobedience, which was published in an edited collection with Yulia Komskaya. Professor Moyd serves the profession and her many communities assiduously and with unflagging selflessness, from editorial service for the AHR, the American Historical Review, one of the preeminent journals in the history discipline, to anti-racist work in her local neighborhood, and such things as the farmers market. She is the ultimate also in a supportive colleague. So we are tremendously lucky that Professor Moyd has time to share her thoughts on history, on the uses of sovereignty, and on East Africa with us today. And I will just repeat that we are going to end promptly just before 5, so jump in early with any questions. I will also remind people who are not speaking to mute their mics so we all have a better experience and apprehension of Professor Moyd's work. And now over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a lovely, so generous introduction. And I'm kind of back because it's not often that you those other kinds of work mentioned as part of an academic. So I really appreciate you doing that extra bit of work there and research to pull all that together. I'd also like to thank Frank Garrett for inviting me along with Rachel.
Michelle, I'm just going to stop you. And every time you turn your face away from your screen, we lose your sound a little bit. So if you can just check what's happening with that, we would greatly appreciate it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to be still.
That's great.
Okay. So I'd like to thank Frank, Garrett, and Rachel for inviting me to do this, to be part of this wonderful series. And I'd also like to thank Larissa Biemund and Kansu Ugus for their work with helping with the arrangements for this virtual talk. And to all of you for being here today. This is a great opportunity for me to share this work. So the paper began as a contribution to a panel on colonialism and sovereignty at the German Studies Association in the US in 2019. And as I often do with these things, I took it as an opportunity to rethink my work through a new lens, which was that of sovereignty. I quickly realized at that point that I had a lot to learn, and truth be told, I really still do. So this is very much a work in progress, and I welcome your comments and questions, suggestions, and so on as I try to shape the piece, perhaps for a journal article to be sent to something like a place like the Journal of African History or somewhere like that. So I'll start. East African peoples and polities asserted themselves against German colonial encroachment between 1888 and 1907, sometimes through armed opposition, sometimes through negotiated settlements or alliances, and in countless other ways. They did so in the face of nascent and patchwork colonial legal or juridical constraints that left peoples living with colonialism with few or no options to challenge or prevent violence against their persons. Those who refused to negotiate or submit to German authority often suffered devastating, deadly consequences at the hands of the colonial army, the Schutztruppe, made up mostly of African colonial troops known as askari. East Africans defended themselves against the threat of extreme violence as best they could, but they were usually outmatched by the Schutztruppe, whose German officers and NCOs organized and trained their men to cause maximum casualties and deaths to their enemies, whether combatants or non-combatants. East African combatants could not defend themselves against the Schutztruppe's use of machine guns, which killed previously unimaginable numbers of soldiers with equally unimaginable speed. None of this should diminish the fact that East Africans consistently sought to defend or, quote, regain independence lost to colonialism, as Tanzanian historian G.C.K. Gwasa put it in his 1973 University of Dar es Salaam dissertation. Gwasa's work was a brilliant and thorough analysis of the 1905 to 1907 Maji-Maji War, a mass anti-colonial struggle brutally defeated by the Schutztruppe. As many as 300,000 people may have died during the war. The Schutztruppe's scorched earth tactics destroyed communities across the southern portion of what is today mainland Tanzania, with devastating demographic effects persisting well into the post-war years. Gwasa's scholarship was part of an outpouring of work in the 1960s and 1970s that prioritized nationalist histories, thereby asserting a usable past for Tanganyika, which became independent in 1961. And then in 1964, Tanganyika united with the islands of Zanzibar to become Tanzania. This body of nationalist scholarship had profound effects on successive generations of scholars who used it as a foundation for interpreting African political histories beyond the German colonial frame, centering the dynamism, creativity, and resolve of African peoples and polities despite German colonial violence and oppression. Maji-Maji became a proto-nationalist moment, an event that exemplified a national spirit well before the founding of Tanganyika in the early 1960s. Since these histories operated within national boundaries and were shaped by nationalist priorities, they did not easily accommodate contradictory or more localized narratives of Maji-Maji. Later generations of scholars trained in social and cultural history methods and using new oral histories and other kinds of archival sources produced new work that shifted away from the so-called statist narratives of Gwasa's generation. Instead, they emphasized local, gendered, and everyday experiences of Maji-Maji in history and memory, as well as its afterlives in continuing German, then British colonialism, and later the successor post-colonial states. In some ways, then, this work decentralized the Maji-Maji narrative, showing that this period of upheaval in the region held different meanings for different peoples and polities. The older scholarship on African resistance still has much to reveal, however, about how people face the ravages of impoverishment, expropriation, and violence under colonialism, how they go on with their lives after genocidal violence like Maji-Maji, how they imagine more just futures. In order to rethink East African peoples' resistance to German colonialism through the lens of sovereignty, I'm beginning to revisit the earliest work on this war. Previous historiographies on Maji-Maji and other examples of anti-colonial resistance to German rule remain indispensable to understanding how African refusal to comply with German imperatives shaped Tanzanian futures. In launching a preemptive defensive war against the Germans, Maji-Maji fighters illustrate the importance of understanding resistance, not simply in its anti-colonial register, but also for its expression of future-oriented vision of a world without colonialism. Gwasa wrote that, quote, "The war is a study of the process of liberation, albeit mass liberation against mass exploitation. In the dialectics between these two dynamic processes," he continued, "lies some of the most important legacies of the war," unquote. In turning to sovereignty as a lens, I pick up on this thread of Gwasa's work. So what do I mean by sovereignty? First, I want to pluralize it so that it isn't just the version that comes most readily to mind for many of us, maybe the Leviathan picture or the Westphalian version in which each state has exclusive sovereignty over its territory. Douglas Howland and Louise White argue that, quote, "sovereignty is a set of practices that are historically contingent," unquote. They call for, quoting them again, "shifting our focus away from the state to look instead at the sovereign rights of those who have been disenfranchised by modern constitutional forms," unquote. To undercut and disrupt persistent underlying assumptions in scholarship, including my own, that German colonialism constituted some sort of political and territorial legitimacy, I want to amplify East African peoples' imaginings of their own sovereign worlds and their mechanisms for enforcing the boundaries of their control. And this is in many ways still aspirational. I have much more, I need to do much closer research, paying attention to language and such, but that is the goal ultimately. Despite multidimensional and relentless German violence against them, the German theft of, quote, "territories that belong to others," as Audra Simpson puts it, East African peoples named and challenged the German assaults that threatened their lives, livelihoods, and cosmologies. Their efforts to defend themselves and their interests often appear in the historiography as rebellion or uprising, both of which are powerful words that assume German political legitimacy in East Africa. Thus, writing about African resistance to colonialism in all its forms still, to my mind, replicates a logic that does not account for African efforts to assert, maintain, or restore a sense of dignity. As David Troyer writes with regard to indigenous histories in the United States, though, quote, "sovereignty isn't only a legal attitude or a political reality, it has a social dimension as well. The idea and practice of sovereignty carries with it a kind of dignity, a way of relating to the self, to others, to the past, and to the future that is dimensionally distinct," unquote. I think about sovereignty among East African peoples in a similar mode as, quote, "residing in the consciousness of indigenous peoples," quoting there again from Audra Simpson, as dynamic and responsive to both quotidian and crisis conditions of colonial rule. I've also been thinking with Ariela Aisha Azoulay's Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism. She writes about two kinds of sovereignty. One she calls worldly sovereignty, and I'll just read a quote from her on what she means by this. Worldly sovereignty refers to the persisting and repressed forms and formations of being in the world, shaped by and through intimate knowledge of the world and its secrets, of its multiple natural, spiritual, political, and cosmological taxonomies, preserved and transmitted over generations and shared among those entitled and invested to protect them. Azoulay contrasts worldly sovereignty with imperial sovereignty, which, again quoting her, consists of and manifests itself through ruling apparatuses with minimum connection to worldly activities, which it tends to destroy or replace by extractive, productive, and computational activities required for its own operations, unquote. So these are the colonizers in my mind. And in the paper that informs this talk, I write about a key figure in Maji-Maji, Kinjekitile, whose anti-colonial expression espoused something similar to what Azoulay describes as worldly sovereignty, a vision delivered in familiar but also novel religious modes that moved peoples of the region to wage a preemptive defensive war against German colonizers and their enablers. This war would interrupt colonialism's destructive and extractive tendencies. As I have written elsewhere, Kinjekitile's words and blessings conjured a vision of human rights before a human rights discourse that included Black and Brown peoples living under imperial control existed within international law. Kinjekitile did not live to see the aftermaths of Maji-Maji, but the afterlives of Maji-Maji's prophetic resonances continued reverberating across decades in the stories the survivors told each other and to the University of Dar es Salaam students who recorded them in the 1960s, the decade of African liberation. So the paper is currently structured around three examples that I think of as lenses for examining sovereignty in relation to resistance. But today I'm just going to talk to you about the last section of the paper, which is an analysis of two images. And I'll just give you a heads up that the two images I'm centering in the talk depict executions by hanging of Black people. These are reminiscent of lynching images from U.S. history. And as part of my talk, what I'll be doing is trying to build context around these images in order to show some of my methodology as I work through drafts of this paper. So let me share my screen. Okay, so I think you can see, I hope you can see this map, and I can't see you, so if someone could maybe give me a verbal confirmation.
We can see
Yes.
Thank you. So just before I start, for orientation for understanding what happened during Maji-Maji, so this is a map of what is today mainland Tanzania for the most part. And you can see that the sort of epicenter of where the rebellion, as it's typically called, began. And then you can see that it sort of began to radiate out from there to spread more widely across this territory through messengers who carried the message of the prophet Kinjekitile. And then these arrows show the German response, counterinsurgency, as they would have thought of it, after a landing here of reinforcements who came from Germany. The Schutztruppe Askari set out on three kind of routes to challenge the spread of the armed resistance, and ultimately it was this organized approach that the Schutztruppe undertook in conjunction with their firepower that allowed for them to defeat the Maji-Maji fighters over the course of about a year. So that's kind of the geographic orientation. All right. So now just to turn to the two images that I mentioned. This section returns to the Maji-Maji War to examine how its visual representations might also suggest something beyond destruction, death, or erasure. It briefly examines two images of execution scenes from Maji-Maji, one a sketch drawn by an African artist named Barnabas, and one a photograph taken by a white German soldier. The images are evidence and traces of the worst German atrocities perpetrated against East African peoples during Maji-Maji. By executing these men whose names are lost to us, German Schutztruppe officers, NCOs, and Askari performed a ritual of colonial mastery designed to reinforce their imagined sovereignty. How can these images be read through a different... Can you hear me? I'm getting an echo.
Everybody make sure your mics are turned off. Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. So how can these images be read through a different lens of sovereignty? Following from my existing research, I might simply argue that the photograph projects a German vision of sovereignty enacted through the public executions of African men likely accused of being ringleaders, so-called ringleaders of the Maji-Maji War. But reading it in conjunction with Barnabas's drawing complicates and disrupts that reading. Following Tina Kampt and other scholars who work at the intersection of history and visual culture, I suggest listening to images as a productive method for understanding Maji-Maji afterlives. For Kampt, listening to images is at once a description and a method. And this is a quote that I pulled from her text, Listening to Images, which kind of gives you a sense of what she means by this methodological intervention, where she is, what she's focusing on in her book, or at least part of her book, are identity photos, which typically one would think wouldn't have much to offer in terms of interpretive possibilities, but she argues that through listening to the images and paying attention to the frequencies that they emit, in a way, that we have more to gain in using these kinds of materials in historical interpretation and as evidence. So that's kind of who I'm thinking with in this part of the paper. Up to this point, my research and my viewing of these images has focused on the Askari, who frequently appear in the visual and written source material. In studying the Askari, I looked beyond existing flat historiographical representations of them as either the loyal and brave defenders of German colonial rule, or as brutal mercenaries guilty of countless atrocities against ordinary African men, women, and children. In either of these stereotyped renditions of the Askari, they appear as unthinking machines, Foucauldian docile bodies who responded unquestioningly to German leadership or to the salaries the Schutztruppe paid them to fight their colonial wars for them. The Askari were, by most accounts, excellent soldiers who remained loyal to their German officers, and their work included countless acts of extortion, plunder, corporal punishment, rape, and killing. During Maji-Maji, Askari killed thousands of Africans in battle and in the scorched earth campaigns characteristic of the war. They also participated in summary executions of so-called ringleaders and other men, judged as combatants or potential combatants who they captured during the war. Even after Maji-Maji ended, the executions continued. The Askari served in highly visible ceremonial and functionary roles at the hanging scenes. They also enforced martial law in the defeated regions. Although German officers and NCOs were present at the executions, they positioned themselves in supervisory roles. They read the proclamations, observed the process to ensure it was conducted according to protocol, and medically determined that death had occurred. They did not, however, operate the gallows technology that sent prisoners to their deaths. White Germans, usually dressed in white ceremonial uniforms, stood apart from the khaki-clad black askari. Germans did not stand in formation or perform the same kinds of ceremonial or crowd management functions as the askari. Their distance from the physical act of killing shifted much of the responsibility of execution and performance of its ritual aspects onto the askari. The only German officials as closely implicated in the violence of the executions themselves were the military doctors or medical NCOs who examined the bodies of the hanged to confirm death. To African observers, the askari, who far outnumbered white German Schutztruppe members, were the most visible representatives and perpetrators of colonial violence. It is thus not surprising that in oral histories of Maji-Maji survivors, the askari figured more prominently as violent oppressors than did the white German officers and NCOs who gave the orders to cause physical harm. As one elder described German colonial rule,
mute mics, everybody, mute mics.
So I have kind of an extended quotation here from the Maji-Maji research papers in which an elder describes the horrors of German colonial rule, which included arbitrary administration of flogging, 25, the kind of infamous Hamza Ishirini, 25 strokes with a hide whip, theft of people's livestock and goods, sometimes even people's family members. And so there's a whole sort of description of this kind of abusive environment that the askari promoted in their everyday activities, and which were heightened during this conflict. And so this elder who offered this quote, or whose quote is taken from his oral history, makes an explicit connection between what one historian of German colonialism calls the theatricality of colonial power and the people who were its main instrument, the askari. Trumpets sounding from the local station could provoke the same kind of fear as seeing the askari themselves. African witnesses to askari abuses noted their unpredictable presence, their arbitrary demands, their impunity, and their seeming autonomy despite being the employees of the German colonial regime. In other oral histories, the interviewees sometimes could not even find words to describe the crimes perpetrated by the askari, and their silences are left to convey what words could not. In short, many African survivors of Maji-Maji experienced the askari as powerful agents of German rule, whose willingness to use violence was beyond doubt. In 1926, the German anthropologist Karl Woille published a collection of sketches drawn by Africans whom he had met during a research expedition to German East Africa in 1906, right in the midst of the war. The drawings included numerous typical depictions of aspects of East African daily life, including hunting and fishing scenes, flora and fauna, buildings, expeditions, and various representations of the quotidian activities of both Africans and Germans. Among the sketches depicting people, one strikes me as particularly disturbing. In this sketch, the Makua artist Barnabas drew two askari, rifles over their shoulders, presiding over the hanging of three people, their arms tied behind their backs, their feet bound. The caption reads, "Hanging Scene from the Maji-Maji War." It was, according to Woille, a time when executions were hardly rare. He expressed skepticism that such scenes of, quote, mass execution, unquote, ever actually occurred, though as you know, as I have learned through my own studies, photographic and other evidence from the period shows that he was misguided, or perhaps more likely, dissembling. A photo of a mass hanging that occurred in 1907 became public in May 1926 when the British weekly newspaper East Africa published an inflammatory article accusing Germany of atrocities in its former colonies. The newspaper published the photo as proof of past German atrocities in a propaganda effort designed to thwart German calls for restoration of its empire following the Versailles Treaty's stipulation that Germany should be stripped of its colonies. The article and photo attracted the attention of Germany's Foreign Office, sparking a flurry of correspondence in which Foreign Office officials asked former residents of German East Africa to confirm its veracity and to determine who had posed for it. Most respondents insisted that it was a forgery, citing numerous supposed inconsistencies that made it, quote, totally unthinkable, as one officer put it. Nonetheless, in the end, the Foreign Office determined that the photo was authentic, that it had been taken in 1907 by a German NCO, and that those hanged were Africans accused of treason during Maji Maji. They decided it was in Germany's best interest to let the issue die quietly rather than continuing to fuel Allied propaganda against Germany as it argued for the return of its colonies. This photograph records a fairly common scene in the history of German East Africa, and it meant something to the NCO who took the photo. The circumstances of its recovery by the British suggest that he had kept it as a trophy, as a commemoration of a moment of mastery, a moment of martial masculine authority that resurfaced in 1920s Germany, where different military masculinities competed with each other, often violently, in public. Initially, in focusing on the uniformed armed askari in these images, I looked away from other focal points of the representations, the nameless hanged Africans, the gloating white NCOs who stare directly into the camera. Next, I tried to see them in their relational position to other subjects in the images. In the sketch, the askari are related to their chained or hanged prisoners and thus marked as perpetrators in the everyday regime of violence that characterized life in German East Africa. They are facing the scaffold, and one has his arm raised in an indicating, perhaps directive, gesture. In both images, the askari's uniformed, fully clothed bodies contrast with the partly clothed, emaciated, and broken bodies of the hanged men. In the photo, the askari are not looking in the direction of the gallows. Instead, the one on the viewing left looks into the middle distance demanded of a soldier standing at attention. The three askari on the viewing right look towards the photographer. The image is undoubtedly staged, but it is not static. In its lower frequencies, it, quote, hovers between stillness and movement, unquote. The askaris on the right are relaxed, looking towards the photographer, seemingly unbothered. The askari on the left stands at attention, this corner of the photograph vibrating with Schutztruppe military discipline as a German officer seems to be half-heartedly evaluating him. Behind and alongside them, with the ritual performance of colonial mastery concluded, hang the dead bodies of 9 men with nooses around their necks. Beyond the little I know about the producers of these images, the two images do not reveal who might have observed these executions. Nevertheless, we should think about the askari in relation to the potential viewers as well. In other historical contexts, armed forces were used to keep unruly crowds at executions under control so that they would not disrupt the proceedings. But they were there for other reasons too. As Foucault explains in Discipline and Punish, a whole military machine surrounded the scaffold. This was intended, of course, to prevent any escape or show of force. It was also to prevent any outburst of sympathy or anger on the part of the people, any attempt to save the condemned or to have them immediately put to death. but it was also a reminder that every crime constituted, as it were, a rebellion against the law, and that the criminal was an enemy of the prince. All these reasons made the public execution more than an act of justice. It was a manifestation of force, or rather, it was justice as the physical, material, and awesome force of the sovereign deployed there. The ceremony of the public torture and execution displayed for all to see the power relation that gave his force to the law. In the colonial context, the Askari stood for the state's retributive power. Their presence contributed to a performance of sovereignty based on the power to kill at will. But what did African audiences see? As the historian Jonathan Glassman has argued, following Gramsci, crowds in East Africa could embody a, quote, contradictory consciousness composed of many different fragments of thought originating in many different times and places. I have more questions than answers to the question I posed, though I'm confident that more answers can be found in close readings of the Maji-Maji research papers, for example. I'm going to stop sharing these images at the moment. I selected these images because I know relatively, sorry, let me get back to Starleaf. I selected these images because I know relatively more about their provenance and the context of their production than I do others. I have already explained the origins of the photograph. The sketch was drawn by Barnabas, a Makua man who knew the anthropologist Carl Voila quite well. He was a government employee, a postal clerk in Lindi, the coastal city where Voila lived when he was not on expeditions. Barnabas was thus a colonial government employee entrusted with handling European mail. He had been educated at a colonial government school where he had learned to draw. Voila considered Barnabas's drawings to be far superior to those of the other unexperienced artists who contributed their work to his collection. Yet he criticized Barnabas's rendition of the hanging scene in the manner of an art teacher. Here I'm quoting Voila. In conception and execution, one finds much that is right and only a few things wrong. The position of the noose on the throat sides of the delinquents instead of on the neck side is wrong. The almost proud head posture with open eyes of the hanged is also wrong. But he gets right the execution scaffold with the ladder that is suddenly pulled out from under the feet of the condemned, whereby he falls until the noose pulls tight and the neck breaks. Correct also are the two soldiers with their guns on safety, who cannot be missing from any execution. Clearly, Voila had paid attention to what he called an unedifying spectacle that he encountered immediately upon arrival in East Africa in 1906. But in denigrating Barnabas's artistic abilities, he also missed the postal clerk's ability to see the hanged men as possessing some kind of dignity, as fellow men who had lived before they died on the scaffold. What if we use Barnabas's drawing as a comparative image or template for reading the atrocity photograph of 9 hanged Maji-Maji participants? What if we prioritize interpreting it not from the perspective of state agents invested in picturing colonial domination, but instead for what the hanged men in the photograph can teach us about sovereignty and its costs? Barnabas was himself a colonial agent, proximate to German authority, a beneficiary of the colonial state's violence in Maji-Maji. But his drawing prompts me to look at the photograph differently. In the spirit of Christina Sharp's wake work, I study both the colonial structures that have sought to deny African peoples sovereignties and the ways that, despite those denials, they have nonetheless, quote, lived lives meant to be unlivable, unquote. In my ongoing work, I center a decolonial, in quotation marks, approach to sovereignty that links histories of African quests for sovereignty to indigenous histories of resistance. According to Teju Cole, quote, the prophetic is simply a fierce ability to see the present, unquote. Kinjeketile and other Maji-Maji ritual specialists read the present as untenable and envisioned a better world free of German colonizers. Like indigenous knowledge keepers in North America, they sought to change the colonial present and to imagine a decolonial future by reconnecting to indigenous places and histories. And there I'm quoting Nick Estes, his book, Our History is the Future. The misery of Maji Maji and its aftermath is undeniable, but it was also a time of meaning-making, religious conversion, and eclecticism, new political formations and hierarchies, new gender norms and labor expectations, new diets, new relationships to the environment, new patterns of exchange, and new expressive forms. This post-Maji Maji world was full of hardships and uncertainties, necessitating the creation of new kinds of spaces and economies of conformity to German imperatives that also functioned as, quote, spaces for and practices of an ethics of care, as Christina Sharp puts it. And people moved. In 1968, an elder from Mamboya named Gabriel Chagola ended his Maji Maji research project interview with a succinct but evocative reflection on a world beyond war weariness, if not colonialism. Quote, soon after the Maji Maji War, I went to Colossa to work in German fields, and I have traveled to many far-off places in my life. The coconuts I helped to plant at Colossa can be seen even today. At the time of his interview, political sovereignty of the territorial variety, independence, for Tanzanians had only existed for about 7 years. In this light, his reference to the still visible fruits of his labor in Colossa perhaps espoused both the limits on his freedom and the creative, life-affirming, community-building potential of planting, a quintessential form of wake work. Or, thinking with Kevin Kwashi, Mzee Chagola's remembrance suggests, quote, a consciousness that exists beyond the expectation of resistance, unquote. In short, quoting again from Kevin Kwashi, resistance, but other capacities too, like quiet, unquote. And that is the end of my paper. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Michelle. Much applause. I don't know if we have emojis in Starleaf for that iconic hand clapping, but the thanks are pouring in on the chat. And again, a poetic end. So silence to silence. But we will keep speaking. Yes, I see the clapping hands coming in. So I will watch the chat for questions. Is there anybody who wants to unmute and start off with a voiced question? You can put your video on and unmute. Okay, I'll start while I think people are sort of reeling from the poetry power. Oh, hang on. No, is that you, Wouter?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
Great. I was struggling with my mute button. First of all, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful presentation on Tanzania. I've been there once as a child, so there was this small personal connection. But anyway, my question is mainly about the Askari and their motivation, because you said that they are unfairly portrayed as mindless slaves to a German empire, either fiercely loyal or fiercely brutal, in whatever you want to put it. But then if they had more autonomy in that sense, what motivated them? What was their aim in this Maji Maji war? And what does the term Maji Maji mean, actually?
Yes. So I'll start with that last part first, because it's important. And that context building piece of my paper got left out. Maji, the word for water in Kiswahili is maji. And so maji is sort of an amplification of that. And the reason that water is important in the maji history is that so Kinjeketile, this figure, this prophet that I mentioned, he built a strong reputation beginning in 1904, actually, for being in possession of the most efficacious version of maji, which was deemed to be kind of a blessed substance, that if people partook of it, or if it was sprinkled on them, would provide protections. And this became relevant during Maji because it was believed that being blessed by the water, either from Kinjeketile or one of his messengers, would provide protection strong enough to even stop bullets, right? So it was believed to. So the combination of Kinjeketile's reputation as a healer, as somebody who possessed this especially efficacious substance, or who could convert water into this substance, and then who could bestow these blessings on people who were also being motivated at the same time to go to war against the Germans. That's why the Maji is important. And so Maji then becomes kind of a rallying cry, and then took on the name of, or became the sort of referent for this whole conflict. The only other thing I'll say about the Maji is that this was not something that came out of nowhere. Kinjeketile was a major prophet who appeared at an important moment in kind of, I think, an intensification of colonial extractive practices and logics. But he was actually representative of a much longer tradition of healing practices in the region, where similar kinds of rituals and this sort of sanctified water was also used for the protection of plantings, right, of people's gardens, of people's subsistence plots. So and this is stuff I'm still thinking through, so this is actually really helpful. But this connection to the land, to healing practices, and the ways that those could then be transformed to serve a kind of revolutionary logic and message are important context for understanding how we might think of these things in terms of sovereignty through an East African lens. So thank you.
Thank you.
So now Askari motivations, and I'll try to keep this a little bit briefer. So the Askari were men who were recruited beginning in 1890 to serve German purposes in the conquest of what they envisioned as German East Africa. These were men who had histories either as soldiers in other contexts, or who had particular skill sets that could be easily translated into soldiering in this kind of expeditionary model of warfare. So, for example, Nyamwezi men who were recruited from within what became German East Africa were men whose masculinities were in some ways tied to traditions of long-distance caravan trade, trading, which involved also being proficient in certain ways with being able to handle weapons, hunting, that sort of thing. So these were men who were motivated in some ways by the profession because it secured a path to masculinity and a masculine adulthood that was becoming harder to access as colonial gendered expectations around labor transformed the region in some profound ways. But I think what you see happen, what happens by the time of Maji Maji is that the Askari have become, through the Schutztruppe organization, they have formed a kind of identity unto themselves that does position the rest of the population as the enemy, and they position them as the enemy in terms in a sort of racist civilizationist way, or anti-Black civilizationist way, let's say. That the language that they use to describe people who are not part of the colonial orbit are washenzi. Shenzi is a derogatory term for people who are barbarians, considered barbarians, backwater, Hicks, that sort of thing. So I believe that what's going on for the Askari by 1905, 1907 is kind of a fully formed sense of themselves as people who are positioned proximate to the colonizers and distant, increasingly distant from the vast majority of the people who live in the territory. So I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you.
And there's a long question in the chat. Eric, do you want to ask it yourself?
I can. Yeah. Thanks for this talk. My question is really about the memory of Maji Maji within Tanzania, and particularly then in relation to current discussions in Germany, because I noted recently that the ambassador in Berlin recently voiced demands for reparations claims, or to initiate negotiations between the two governments. But at the same time, it seems to me that these discussions weren't really ongoing in Tanzania itself. And I was wondering how come that on an intergovernmental basis there are such initiatives, but then within Tanzania there aren't. And yeah, I was wondering about your view of Tanzanian perspectives currently on Maji Maji. And you mentioned these fragmented perspectives, the localized perspectives. So perhaps you could say something more about this.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I wish I had a satisfying answer. I mean, I think one possibility is that the British period between 1916, when the British began instituting governance after the Germans were pushed out, for the most part, of German East Africa during World War I, and then up to independence in 1961, that long British period may have interfered with kind of the formation of collective sense of grievance around Maji Maji. And I think also that Julius Nyerere's politics after independence were not so invested in trying to get ex-colonizers to own up to past violence, right? I mean, the logic of Nyerere's regime, and I think many independents, the first leaders of African independent nation states, was more about how do we construct a country, a nation, out of many peoples, and out of the rubble of or the violence of colonialism. What are the things that can be done to build a nation, not in response to the colonizers, but for the people who live in these countries, right? So, and Nyerere is interesting because he immediately sets about the task of trying to make Kiswahili into a national language, for example, increasing literacy rates in Kiswahili. He was famous for sort of instituting or putting into practice a third way socialism. He oriented himself towards other global South countries that could provide aid, as opposed to orienting himself towards the great powers. And as part of this push to build what I referred to earlier in the paper as a usable past, the universities, right, become the knowledge producers. And within that, again, the sort of hopscotching or leapfrogging over the British period back to the German period and pulling on Maji as this proto-nationalist moment, I think is also perhaps indicative of, maybe a Tanzanian quest for narratives and stories that could convey a self-determined sense of forward motion, as opposed to, this is what the colonizers have done to us, this is how they've harmed us. That's how I'm thinking through it now, kind of on my feet. It would be interesting to do a more careful comparison with Namibian history, of course, which is the contrast, and which, as you know, has a much longer recent history of, at least for the Herero, especially, a longer history of making these claims against the German government. But the Tanzanian case, I don't know exactly why, but those are my ill-formed thoughts on it.
Thank you.
So while I wait, I don't see anybody coming in. Larissa, anything on the email? Nope. Okay, because I have a couple of questions. So one is, I'm actually a comment, the famous comment and a question. I think one of the really interesting things when you think about land and sovereignty is this comparison across different indigenous societies and engagements with colonialism. And certainly in New Zealand, my home country, where the Maori, where Maori sovereignty resides, is so deeply and intimately located in the land. And so there's some quite interesting work on sovereignty there, which is just a comment. And it's interesting to think through these different repositories of sovereignty and contestations of sovereignty and investments in how you have sovereign power over yourself and your land and your being. And so that's a sort of weird comment, reflection, question or a thing. But I have two questions that are much more technical. One is, you mentioned listening to images, which, as somebody who listens to music a lot and analyzes it, intrigues me. And you mentioned lower frequencies and high frequencies. And so if the lower frequency were the Ascari sort of bristling with attention, then what is the higher frequency in that photo, or how do you differentiate between them? This is like a super technical analytic question because it intrigues me as somebody who thinks about methods and listening. And then actually, you've talked about gender a little bit, but that seems to be a strand in your paper that is there, but not as explicitly kind of theorized as some of the other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think the short answer to your, well, first, thank you for the comment on sovereignty and indigeneity. And, as I said, I'm still really learning about indigeneity and sovereignty, and becoming more and more kind of conscious of the fact that I have to pay attention to the land as kind of the primary, as a primary focal point. And that's the piece where I think I need to still spend more time with the Maji research project papers, the oral histories, to pay attention to the language that East African peoples themselves are using to talk about what happened to them in Maji. And so I think, I'm optimistic that I can find those things, but yeah, I think there's, I have more work to do. On the methodological query about listening to images and frequencies, I think here too, I have more thinking to do. And I had not at all thought about, the obvious point of what's the opposite of, or what's the kind of relational point that I'm making about lower frequencies versus higher frequencies. I think what I'm trying to practice with this method of, I've always called it reading images, but trying to think more in terms of listening to them, is, I guess, the way that, I suppose if you look at the image quickly and on a first take, what you see is an execution atrocity photograph, right? And there's no way around that. That is in fact what it is. And I think the old way, or my old way of thinking about an image like that would have been, okay, I don't know anything about any of the men who have been hanged. I don't know their names. I don't know where they came from. I know nothing about them. So does that mean that the image is unusable beyond the illustration of the atrocity? So I don't know if that initial read is the higher frequency. The higher frequency could just be that this is the extreme violence that colonialism represents, and it happens with a frequency that is, it's every day. Especially in an emergency time like this. The lower frequencies, though, and the part where I think some of my skills as a military historian can come into play, is that I can see the ways that this photograph is also revealing some things about how the Askari are both participants in the violence, but also are in relation to both the men who have been executed and their officers. And so I think the more I continue to think about those aspects, and if I can take the next step of looking more closely at the hanged men themselves, and I don't know if that's a step I can take or will take, that perhaps there's more to be said there, especially, again, like using Barnabas's drawing as a sort of alternate way into viewing the photograph, I suppose. Gender. So yeah, I primarily, when I write about gender, I primarily write about military masculinities. And that's a thread throughout my work. There's a bit in my book about, the women who were part of Askari households, part of Schutztruppe garrisons, who, served in reproductive, productive, and of course, affective roles in this history. They're less visible in the materials that I'm looking at, that I looked at for this paper, but I think one piece that I definitely need to draw out more is that Kinjeketile's prophetic practice is actually part of, so I said earlier, this wider regional set of practices around health and healing rituals, which is often dominated by women. Women are the ones who do that work. And so part of the critique that emerged of the Maji proto-nationalist narrative in the 60s, so the critique that emerged in the 90s, looking back to the 60s and 70s, was that Kinjekitile had been pulled out and turned into this, sort of dominant figure in the Maji narrative, when in fact he was just one of many such prophets who were operating in the region. And the fact that he became the kind of figurehead for the whole movement is highly gendered, right? I mean, once you know that context, then you can understand, you can kind of see how not only the German colonial masculine gaze pulls Kinjekitile out of a regional set of practices that produce prophets and practitioners, but then also that the University of Dar es Salaam students who are collecting the oral histories and the people who are narrating the oral histories, who are mostly men, are also pulling him out and putting him forward as this kind of national figure. So I think there's a lot, in short, there's a lot more to do with gender. And this piece, I think the backstory is that I assume quite a bit around understandings of military masculinity that come from my previous work, but could afford to be articulated more clearly.
I think it's a concept where many of us are familiar with. Walter, you have another question. Building sort of on this question about sovereignty and land, actually.
Right. So there are various ways in which you can approach the concept of sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
And the European concept is very much centered around territory.
Mm-hmm.
You are sovereign over a particular defined territory and the people that live there.
Mm-hmm.
Many tribes in the Americas before the Europeans arrived had a very different notion around sovereignty. You were sovereign as a people traveling these lands as common lands where you came, you had some resources and you went on and so on and so on. So I was wondering where in this, spectrum of different versions of sovereignty the natives of East Africa found themselves and how that interacted with the European notion of territorial sovereignty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think one that I'm still really kind of immersed in and trying to think through. But, again, I think the first thing to be said about German East Africa, like most territories that were constructed by Europeans out, as a result of the Berlin Conference, encompassed many, many different peoples, right? With different, who couldn't be more different from each other in a lot of ways, right? There's, sedentary peoples and peoples who are herders of livestock, and people like the Nyamwezi who have, whose lives are sedentary in certain regards, but then who have this ethos, ethos of travel, long distance travel, as being very important to how one becomes an adult, for men and women, actually, not just men. You have coastal peoples who specialize in fishing and trade on the ocean. So all of that, all of those peoples would deserve to be understood as having certain versions of sovereignties that are rooted in what's important to them. So I think for my purposes, in thinking about, if I limit it to Maji, for example, we know that the people around the area where Kinjikitile began giving his, sort of giving his sermons and doing this water ritual. We know that people in that region were affected by the colonial push to move to plantation agriculture, where their preference and their need, not just preference, but their need, was to continue being able to do subsistence agriculture so that they could feed themselves, right? So those practices of local agriculture and the importance of the relationship to the land there is quite clear in that particular place. And so I think I would have to, and I will need to, be very careful about kind of thinking through how Maji spread from one place to another through across a massive region, right? I mean, I didn't explain when I talked through the map, but that the southern half, essentially the whole southern half of the territory, was considered to be at war against the Germans, and that encompassed many, many different peoples who not only were in struggle against the Germans, but who were navigating their own internal struggles against other East African peoples. So it's complicated. And so what I've shown you today is a pretty simplistic first take of what's on my mind. But I think that would be the first order of business, is to sort of think through what these different peoples prioritized in terms of their own sense of themselves, how they make a living, what they believe about the spiritual world, how they articulate ideas about the future, that sort of thing.
Thank you.
But thank you for the question and the point.
Go ahead, Larissa.
There was a question in the email.
I just have to plug in my laptop. I just got a message that it's going to die.
We are all familiar with that sort of scenario. Larissa, do you want to read it, or shall I? I'm easy either way.
You can do it.
So a question from Donald Hassett, University College Cork, who actually works on Algeria and also on Ireland, both countries which have also very similarly complex internal situations, and with vis-a-vis sovereignty, colonialism, colonizers. Anyway, he says, thank you so much for a fantastic paper. Could you say more about the context in which the students in Dar es Salaam carried out the oral history research and how it related to broader thinking about colonial pasts and post-colonial futures that was so central to the university's identity at that period? Oh, and sorry, Donald, just saw your last comment, but I asked for you.
Okay. Thanks, Donald, and good to see you here. Let's see. I actually need to learn more about kind of the details of how the project came together, and I think for that I can turn to some of the memoirs of professors who were present at that time, like Terrence Ranger and Walter Rodney. There were professors who went on to have luminous careers as historians and activists, and they were the ones who were also doing this foundational work of building the university, quickly bringing on board students and I believe these were undergraduates actually who went out to their home communities and did these interviews with elders. So, and keep in mind that these were people who had been children, more or less youth, during the war. So my understanding is that these students were dispatched to their home communities to do oral histories, and then those were all transcribed and collected into this volume, which exists in TypeScript. There are a limited number of copies in the world, and it's a very thick collection of oral histories that are divided up by region, and supervised by people like John Iliff and G.C.K. Gwasa, whose dissertation actually was one of the first African-authored pieces that drew on those interviews, right? So that's another thing that I need to do, is go back to Gwasa's dissertation and think through what he was trying to do in that moment, which was in part about rendering a Marxist interpretation of the past in keeping with what Nyerere wanted for Tanzania in terms of a socialist future, but also kind of clearly casting the Germans as villains in this history, right? So yeah, I mean, I don't know that was a super pulled together answer, but I think those are the dynamics that are in play when the volume is being put together in the late 60s. Again, sort of, I mean, it's amazing to me to think about this, but the founding of an independent nation state, the founding of a university, a department of history, the bringing on of students, sending students out to the field to talk to their people about this long trajectory of a history that they had certainly heard about growing up themselves, but which they now come to think of in this kind of in these nascent disciplinary terms, right? As African history is being founded as a discipline, all of that happening at the same time. It's kind of really amazing and inspiring. And so anyway, I just riffed on that. I'm not sure exactly if that gets to what you're asking about, Donald, but I do want to pay more attention to that.
You're riffing, you're listening. We have 9 minutes left and 2 questions. So
okay.
Paul and Marin, why don't you say them very quickly, and then Michelle can do as much as she can in the time available.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Paul Doolan. I'm calling you from Zurich in Switzerland, though I'm originally from Cork, Ireland, where Donald is from as well. I was just thinking of the Dutch colonial situation when I was listening to you, and I don't know if you know much about to say whether the comparisons are superficial or not, but in 1905, the Maji-Maji War, at that time the Dutch were fighting a war, the Aceh War on Sumatra, and a number of photographs from 1904, Dutch atrocity photographs emerged. And Paul Byle from the University of Amsterdam wrote this book, Emerging Memory, about those photographs. And I thought that was an interesting comparison with what you were doing with your visuals also. And then regarding the Askari, of course, the Royal Dutch colonial army in the Indies recruited local soldiers as well, and particularly the Moluccans. Maybe similar to the Askari, and when it emerged that the Dutch committed widespread atrocities in their colonial reconquest of Indonesia after the war, after World War II, it was often said it was local troops carried out atrocities, but we now know that that is not the case. The greatest atrocities were committed by special forces of the Dutch army. So it seemed to me that there were quite a few comparisons to be made there.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate those. And
Michelle, I'm just gonna get Myron to say his question quickly, and then you can take it to the time.
Yep.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So my question was basically, thank you for this great talk. I learned a lot from it, and my question is that given that many of the influential theories which we use to think about sovereignty come from Germany around, say, the turn of the 20th century, a little bit later, Weber and Carl Schmitt and so on, I was thinking, can we find traces of the German colonial experience, maybe specifically this experience, in their work?
Yeah. So I'll just quickly comment on both. So I started to say thank you to Paul for for those comparative references, and I will definitely look those up because, and I think it's not unusual to see examples like this happening synchronically across different empires, because I do think actually there's something about this period from 1890 to the outbreak of World War I that represents an intensification of these extractive processes. I don't know the history of Sumatra or what's going on in the Dutch colonies, but I'm not at all surprised to hear that at the same time that what's happening in German East Africa, there are similar things happening elsewhere. So thank you. Marin, I actually would have to, so this is more reading that I need to do. I guess I have been kind of operating with my own sense of what sovereignty means, and I haven't necessarily spent a lot of time looking at the theories, except to kind of read through the secondary literature and the interpretations that I've gleaned from those that seem to suggest that in this moment, German colonizers are operating with a very clear sense of a defined territorial space that emerges from the Berlin Conference, but is informed by the colonial presence that already existed through company representatives, missionaries, explorers, etc. Right? So there's this knowledge production that feeds into an understanding of what, how the territory could be defined, and then, you know, the process of effective occupation, which takes place during the 1890s, is what brings that into fruition, or fulfills the fantasy, I guess, or the vision of that territorial outline, which European powers have agreed to, but which, of course, is not has not been consented to by African peoples, obviously, and also is not especially interested in what those people think about this idea of territory, right? So I think there are lots of layers here, and you know, my title is hopefully suggestive of a direction I hope that this paper will go, which is to kind of really fill that out and say something about the different registers within which we can think about sovereignties, and I'm trying to practice doing it in the plural as a way of kind of denaturalizing or disrupting the assumptions about nation states as the way things have always been, or something.
And that is the perfect final comment, because it actually exemplifies, and thank you, Marin and Paul and everybody, and Wouter and everybody who gave questions and sort of insights. And I know that, Michelle, you will use them to think forward, because I know how you work. And but I think that is the perfect ending statement, because it refers again to the process of disruption, which, even if one is skeptical or thinks that perhaps decolonial has become too much of a fashionable term rather than a serious enterprise, the unsettling of knowledge, the dethinking and rethinking of sovereignty to sovereignties is precisely what we're all about, and the centering of different voices, different stories, new methodologies to read sources such that they privilege voices that have not always been privileged in the academy in the past. This is our business, right? And thank you for conducting it superbly well today and inviting us to think along with you, Michelle. So we are very grateful. Hundreds of compliments and comments in the chat. And you are out in time for your meeting with the president. So thank you, Michelle.
Yeah,
thank you, everybody.
Thank you all so much for your wonderfully engaged